So I'm going to take both of my my exterior and my lining panels, and I'm going to position them on my table so that the open ends are facing each other. So you can see they're facing each other. I'm going to take the corners from the top. I'm just going to fold the bottom part out of the way. Corners from the top side and match them. And I'm going to turn it over, take the corners from the bottom side and match them and just clip them in place. Now it is important that you match these carefully. If you don't, you'll end up with a wonky looking pouch. So you can see there that we've basically, if I pull that, you've created a sort of almost a cross. So use your fingers down the sides of that open top bit. And what we're going to do is we're just going to clip right next door to that point where they join together. And we're going to do the same on both sides. So this is the main body of your exterior, this is the main body of your lining, and these bits here are the sort of flappy bits at the top. Do exactly the same on the other side. I'm using my fingers to just push it in, and your seams should meet in the middle, so you should get a perfect little join there if you've measured and stitched correctly. So what you end up with is a cross. So I'm just going to push all of those out of the way, and I am going to stitch from where my stitching finishes down the end of here, across and back up to the same point on the other side. I'm only doing one side though at this point. I'm not doing both sides at the same time, so do be careful that you've got everything else out of the way. So try and start your stitching where your last lot of stitching finished. Again, a couple of back stitches to secure and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's important you stick to the 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you go bigger than 1/4 inch, your frame won't fit. This has been calculated to fit your frame nicely. If you were to do a 3/8 inch seam allowance or even bigger, your frame won't fit. So you would have to, you do need to stick to the seam allowance. It's really important. So there you can see, well, you probably can't actually because I'm stitching in white, but let's get rid of my threads. I've stitched all the way around the outside of one of those sort of top flaps, and I'm just going to do the same thing as I did before, in as much as I'm going to trim off the seam allowance, but I'm curving it in, or curving out rather, towards that point where the line is. Cutting off the corners at 45 degrees. We're just reducing the bulk from the seams here. There we go. Then I'm going to open those two up, and I have the other top flap, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other top flap. You just make sure that the other parts are kind of out of the way. Again, of a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Back stitch a couple of stitches at the beginning to secure my stitching. And your stitching should, and I don't know if you can actually see that, but your stitching should actually meet up with the stitching that you did on the exterior, the bottom of the panels. So your stitching will continue on, it will look like a continuous line. Again, from about 1/4 of an inch on the, to the top of the line, let's just trim away the seam allowance, the corners, trimming down to about half of what we've got, so approximately 1/8 of an inch. Be careful when you cut those corners not to take out any of your stitching. If you cut them too close, you'll lose your stitching and you'll end up with it all unraveling. So that is pretty much all of your sewing done, other than closing our bottom piece. So how easy was that? Now I'm just going to find something to poke out my corners with. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up that bottom that we didn't close up, and I'm going to push this exterior panel, a bit with the fleece on, with my finger out through that hole in the lining. And you can use a chopstick or whatever is your favoured pokey tool to push out the corners. I would if I could get in there. That's one corner. Now remember, you've trimmed off the seam allowance, so don't push too hard, because if you do push too hard, you will split your stitching. And now you have, the bottom part looks fine, but you need to pop your fingers in, because what you're going to try and do is push out those top flaps. So manipulate with your fingers to push out these top pieces. Again, push out the corners gently. So that's one. And I'm going back in again. That's two. Now we can close up that opening that we've made at the bottom. I'm just going to pop out my corners in my lining so that I can see where I need to close. Now, where we did those a few extra stitches at the bottom, we should be able to just turn in the seam allowance on the bottom of our lining. Now I am just going to press that before stitching. Oops. I've got something on my iron here. I seem to have stuff on my iron. I don't have my scratchy thing to clean it, so we're just going to have to worry about that in a moment. And then I'm just going to stitch across the bottom to close that turning gap that we had. And don't be like Christine, change your thread so that it actually matches. I'm using the same cream thread as I've been using all the way along, which isn't actually ideal because my fabric isn't cream. Just a line of stitching at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance just along the bottom there to close that bottom edge up, and then you can push your bottom edge, your lining, back into your pouch. Again, use your pokey tool to push it in, or your fingers. Depends how big your hands are. If you've got big hands like me, it's actually quite difficult to get your hands right in there. Right, you can see that we're now getting there. And what we're going to do now is give the whole thing a really nice press on both sides, and on those flaps. What you want is for none of the exterior fabric to be showing on the inside, and likewise none of the lining fabric to be showing on the outside. So roll between your fingers to make sure that everything is where it needs to be. And there we are. That's the sewing bit all done. Well, more or less. We still have one more bit to do. I'll come back to you in a second and I will show you how to do the last bit to make the frame channel and how to fit your frame.